In the meantime, while she is setting up, just give you 2 words about my background and what I'm going to try and do. I have been working for the last about 20 years in leading interdisciplinary teams. I am partly an anthropologist and a historian, and I'm going to be looking at 4 communities and how they interact. Traditional scientists, complex systems scientists, policy people, and the general public. And I'm going to look at each of those communities as an anthropological community. That is, I'm looking at their ideas as created in a community and subject to the dynamics of those communities. And this is to try and contribute to this bridge that we're talking about. Right, the first couple of slides, I think I can do like this. My very first slide was simply to thank you, to thank the organizers of the symposium over the last 2 days, which was a wonderful occasion, to thank Jan Wouters for inviting me here and keeping me in the loop in what you're all doing here, which I think is a fascinating set of things. And this is the second time that I'm here. My 2 talks, the last time and this one, are somewhat related, but not really very, very specifically related. Now you're going to have to grant me that extra time and not take that from me.
Yeah, oh, you will not have a
It's hard enough as it is to suddenly compress a 3/4 of an hour talk into a 30-minute talk. Basically, how this research started is with the constatation that most politicians and a lot of other people talk about us getting out of our sustainability crisis by way of innovation. And what I think they forget is that it's effectively 250 years of all-around innovation that got us into it. And so we need to come up with a different way to start looking at sustainability and at innovation. Now, the underlying model that I have that underpins sort of my vision on all of this is relatively simple. And it is that any society, individuals need energy. But that what keeps the society together is the processing of information, because that is not subject to any conservation law and can be shared. And so I see societies dynamically as essentially mechanisms that create organization, and that is how I define human beings rather than simply learning. I think what is their characteristic is that they actually organize things, and by organizing it, that is by processing information, they actually gather the energy around them that is needed. Now, I think that the crisis that we're currently living is due to a particularity of that specific system. And that is that for a very long time, and that is where my archaeological background plays, the energy flow and the information flow sort of kept each other in balance. That is, it was expensive to implement innovations in terms of energy, and so innovation went relatively slowly. Now, what has been happening over the last 250 years is that fossil energy has basically taken away that constraint. And so we live a very different way of being as an innovative organism, as a society. Because what we do now is rather than have innovation be determined by demand, that is, only for those things where energy can really and needs to be spent on it, we actually come to a situation where innovation is effectively driven by supply. Now, oh yes, it is coming, okay. Now I anticipated this, so we'll just go. This was going to be my starting sort of image, which basically says, look, we are close to a real crisis. But, and that is where I was now, we also have to think about that relationship between society and the environment. And one of the things that I think is fundamental for our understanding here is that nature is not nature. Nature is a category that is defined by us as a society, and so is culture. And culture is the battlefield on which this articulation between the two happens. Society defines its environment. It decides what the issues are in the environment, and it deals with them in ways that suit the society, but not necessarily the environment. And so sustainability and resilience are fundamentally societal issues that affect the environment. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, that in that planetary boundary paper, and I'm one of the co-authors, so I can criticize it, we basically missed the whole of the social aspect of it. And the main missing planetary boundary, to my mind, is the skewed income distribution within countries and between countries. And this is simply an illustration of that in different ways. Now, why do we keep going? Why don't we do anything about this particular situation? And what I have here is, again, a few of the variables that show that we are not yet on a change in trajectory, whether it's for sea level rise, population increase, temperature rise, or a zillion other characteristics, like Peter Ho mentioned this morning, including McDonald's and what have you. So I was arguing that what has happened, and these are two graphs that illustrate that our energy use has exploded on us over the last 300 years. A human being uses between 100 and 200 watts of energy to actually stay alive. Right now, per capita in the United States, we use 11,000. All of that goes into our infrastructure, whether it's social infrastructure or hard infrastructure. So we are now in what I would argue is sort of a Ponzi scheme where this accelerating mechanism of more and more innovation is beginning to threaten us. Now, why can't we get out of that idea? And that is what most of my talk is going to be about. Why haven't we done much more to achieve change? And in particular, what are the respective roles of science and governance? Can complex systems actually bridge that gap? What are some of the other barriers that are there? Because I think there are fundamental barriers that cannot be overcome by complex system science in the state it is in right now. And then finally, how could we improve the situation? I would argue that the fundamental difference between science and governance, and which causes a lot of the bridge building difficulties that we actually have, is that the two have fundamentally different goals. Science attempts to understand to gain clarity. And in order to do that, our traditional science actually reduces the number of dimensions of a problem to the point that it can actually understand them. So, moreover, it explains the past, and it does not really anticipate emergence. It looks at causality, it explains in terms of causality, in terms of certainty, and not in terms of possibility, probability, or risk. Governance does something very different. It attempts to find solutions. It pushes potential risks into the future, and it tries to find emotionally satisfying solutions that take the various dimensions of the problem actually into account, but do that by keeping the whole thing fuzzy. And so what we have is that there is a very different situation with respect to risk. There is scientific risk determination versus risk governance. Scientists calculate and determine risks. Governance deals with the consequences of risks. There are also different epistemologies. Governance is openly subjective. It challenges the irrational basis of society and mediates that emotionally satisfying operational solution. It deals head-on with complexity. It brings dimensions out. Science has many different objectivities and is not openly subjective. It tries to do the reverse. It investigates the irrational bases by raising questions and trying to find answers. It looks back. It systematically relates the present to the past. Otherwise, you can't prove anything. It simplifies. And so the question becomes, which drives which? simplified visions of each impact on one another, and that is our main bridge building problem in my mind. And in particular, I would argue, the net effect is an operation that strives for clarity versus an operation that strives for ambiguity. Governance reconciles itself with contradictions that cannot be dissolved and muddles through. Science aims to remove the contradiction and therefore builds an unrealistic view of life. And that is where complex systems science comes in. But before I get there, just a couple of terminology things. Because from this perspective, you can understand the difference between sustainability and sustainable development and resilience. Sustainable development is originally a politician's expression. It is emotionally satisfying. It is about an undefinable future state, and we define it ex post as we see it. That is, we choose those things that we like about our present and say that we want to sustain them, and that we can ditch the other ones, or we can modify the other ones. There is no real negotiation of a future state. Resilience is a scientific expression. It is the state of the balance between stability and change. And in order to achieve it, it means that we need to start designing for change, and we need to better understand innovation, which, because we had a reductionist science, has been left as sort of a black box that we had in the side and that had an impact, but that we didn't study inside. So what is the potential role of complexity science? It actually introduces a fundamental shift that makes it much more compatible to what the politicians actually want to do, what governance wants to do, because it amplifies the number of dimensions. It actually looks at trade-offs, and it explicates, or makes explicit, never know what to say about that, the various scenarios that could actually be used in determining the policy. It focuses on emergence rather than origins, and therefore has an ex-ante perspective rather than an ex-post perspective. But more importantly, it enhances the number of dimensions that are being taken into account by contextualizing, by modeling, by futuring. So I am taking as a basis that I think there is a huge synergy possible between complexity science and policy and governance. But what I'm now going to be looking at some of the problems that will encounter to integrate. And I think the number of them are on the cognitive and the perception level. Some of them have to do with categorization. Some of them have to do with the current institutional relationship between science and policy. And some of them have to do with the role of science in society in the wider sense. And we need to deal with them if we are going to be building that bridge that we're talking about. Now, a fundamental thing here is that I think our ideas, our theories, are effectively underdetermined by our observations. That was established by Henri Atlan, a French neurosurgeon who worked on that for a considerable amount of time. But what has not really been considered is that because of that, our theories, our ideas are overdetermined by past experience. The example that he gives is very simple. He says you have 5 traffic lights, they all have 3 states. So you can have 243 states, but you have 10 billion theories that could actually explain those states. And so our theories are insufficient on the basis of the data we have to explain something with any certainty. That means that later experiences build self-referentially on earlier ones, and that is what we generally summarize as path dependency. Difficult to think outside the box. What are the consequences? Well, one of them is that our cognition is very partial, that there are many theories possible about any complex systems. And I think this is a really important element here, that science is only one among them. Science is a culture carried by a community, and it interacts with other cultures that are also carried by other communities. So those kinds of ways to make sense, that is how I see those theories, are essentially the basics of those are acquired very, very young. In the family, in primary school, or even before. And that means that socio-cultural contexts are fundamental. and that there are many barriers to acceptance of new ideas. I heard earlier on, and I don't know whether it was today or yesterday or the day before, the whole idea about scientific illiteracy. Scientific illiteracy has nothing to do with illiteracy in my mind. It is simply that people early on in life have found a different way of explaining the apparently inexplicable to themselves, and that once they are set on that path dependency, they have a really hard time being moved outside it. And certainly that doesn't work by confronting what I think is the solution to one of the questions that was put earlier here, is actual engagement. And for the scientists, to start with the problem the way the politician sees it, and then work from there. Modeling can hugely help. Another consequence is that our ideas are based on a very heavily reduced perception of the environment. We symbolize, we act on that very reduced perception, and our actions actually affect a huge number of dimensions. And so that difference in dimensionality causes what we generally call unanticipated consequences. And over time in any society, what you see is that the risk distribution shifts from known, frequent, short-term risks to unknown, longer-term risks. And the example that I put on here, but there's other ones, and I'll give you another one on the next slide, is Henry Ford's first car. It was wonderful as a short-term solution to improve transport, but nobody realized that 100 years later, it would be poisoning our atmosphere. And I would finally conclude that a crisis, as we have right now, is effectively when a society's information processing dynamic is no longer able to deal with what needs to be done to actually deal with the dynamics in which it's involved. So when it's overwhelmed by the unanticipated consequences of its own prior actions. A story to symbolize that is a tribe in New Guinea, and because my wife worked there, I've been there a number of times. These tribes live on the crest of a hill. They have a perspective where they say they live with their back towards the future. That is, they keep course in their society, like you do in a rowing boat, by looking at a beacon in the past. When something goes wrong, they actually go back to the past and try and exorcise that. In order to do that, they have to have festivals. Those festivals means that they eat pigs. Well, it's exactly the pigs that ruin their environment. So in order to exorcise that problem, they make it worse, because the pigs are the ones that cause the erosion. And ultimately, in this particular case, which has been studied by a colleague of mine, Chris Ballard, they actually end up in the bottom of the valley in the marsh that they created themselves and that they try to avoid like the plague. Now, another barrier that I see here is in the way we perceive and create categories. And I'm basing myself here on the work of Tversky and Kahneman and people like that. And basically what they argue is that there is a difference between the way we perceive when we relate a subject to a referent, or when we relate a referent that is an existing category to a subject. In the first case, we stress similarity in order to create a referent. In the second case, we actually try and distinguish between the referent and the object that we're studying to actually see whether it fits into that category. Now that creates a real problem in the relationship between the milieu and the environment, because the milieu looks at humanity by comparing it to nature, and the environment as another concept, and we permanently articulate those two concepts. There we compare nature to humanity. And so in the first case, we stress differences. In the second case, we stress first case we stress similarities. The second case, we stress differences. So in the first case, the cohesion of nature, its strangeness and force are amplified. And in the second case, the cohesion and strength of nature is diminished, and so on and so forth. I'm not going through all of those, but they are really interesting opposites. If you then look at their interaction, it basically means that the perspectives are complementary and that their interaction exaggerates natural dangers and underestimates human intervention dangers. and therefore encourages society to keep intervening in the environment, and at the same time give the impression to society that its actions reduce risks. But what is happening is that by its actions, the environment is changed so heavily that the predictability of the environment actually is lost. So society thinks it knows more, but in fact it knows less, and it loses control. That is aggravated by the way our culture has institutionalized science. In the left-hand figure, what you see is that a set of phenomena are being studied, and that different epistemologies lead to boxing them in different realms. But once we started institutionalizing our science, we actually did the reverse. We took the realms, took the methods that we had boxed there and developed there, and started applying those to the phenomena. By that point, we could no longer look at them holistically. We had to look at them as separate categories, and we could no longer make that bridge, which is another bridge that we need to overcome. The result is a tangled hierarchy, in the sense that you have, whether you put culture first and nature second, or the other way around, you can never get out of that ambiguity unless you actually admit the fictional nature of the opposition. And here I come back to the fact that what we're talking about is a cultural opposition in our culture and not a natural opposition with culture. One of the ways to do this is the modeling, and the modeling creates a way to begin to conceptualize those dynamics that is derived and applies to and intermediates between the disciplines and the actual phenomena. Now let's look at governance's role in science. Because science has been institutionalized and instrumentalized as a provider of innovation for industry, knowledge for decision making. That has changed the scientific process itself, from observation-driven to discipline-driven. Our worldview has been fractured because from a discipline you only see certain phenomena and not the rest. But it's also changed governance, because science is justifying its decisions, or at least is the fig leaf for the decisions. Enforcing science-based solutions allows top-down management, or actually finds reasons to do it. And so it became reductionist. The one scientific solution is what, in my experience, every politician wants, and I think it is because of this reason. And so ultimately, it changed science's relation to society. It politicized science and made it contentious. And because of a number of those and related phenomena, science is losing society's trust. And I think there's two very fundamental drivers behind that. On the one hand is that over the last 60 years, we have raised the expectations of science as scientists, but to the public, to the point that they're unrealistic and we can't deliver. At the same time, by intervening so much in our environment, we have created more and more unintended consequences, and those increase exponentially. So that loss of trust is real, and it is seen in the difficulties of getting R&D funding, for example. And more importantly, and I think that is one of the good ways why we're here, science and the policy community, but also the society, became effectively defensive, all of them, against each other. And we need to get over that defensiveness. We don't want to impose any values or society to deny that imposition. We need to start rebuilding bridges there. And that is only done by regaining trust. In order to do that, we have to better understand what motivates a number of those audiences. And there's a couple of things that I want to basically argue here, is that any understanding, scientific or other, is part of identity construction. And identity construction is a very complex, partly individual, partly social phenomenon that would be a fantastic topic to model with a complex systems approach. Practitioners' reception of knowledge is never purely intellectual. It is always biased. And in many cases, science is experienced and judged as material social relationships, interactions, and interests. And if we don't have that trust, people will not invest in scientists and their institutions. So both the science and the trust are dynamic, contextual processes that interact with beliefs within social networks. And again, that would be the modeling topic that I would take out of all of this. And then on top of that, of course, each side expects the other to understand. And this is wonderful. If you go into the field and you have a debate with practitioners, the practitioner says, this is my land. This is the area where I live. I know every square meter of it, and I know exactly what it can be do. And that is the Subak situation. The scientist says, but I am legitimate because I am not born here, because I don't know this land, but because I got a university education. That's a debate you can never get out of. And I had to try that a number of times. So that is aggravated in many cases, and this is the work where Brian Wynne, for example, has done very interesting studies, by the fact that scientists now in many societies are associated with government. And because government is distrusted, scientists are fundamentally distrusted. And what the Rice Institute did to the Green Revolution didn't really help. And one farmer in England expressed this as the sense of being ensnared by an alien and unrecognized combination of science and bureaucracy that fundamentally denies the identity of the farmer per se. That is another problem that we have here. Another issue in the same vein is that practitioners and scientists have very different perceptions of what uncertainty is all about. Practitioners have to live with it. They know it, they've seen it 1,000 times, and they know that the outcome will never be what they expect. So they have to always keep in mind ways to adapt to that. The scientist does something else. He determines, or she determines, the actual uncertainty and the risk, but generally doesn't have to live with it. And that makes a big difference. And so what we need to do is, and these are my last 4 or 5 slides, and I'll go through them fairly quickly, is we need to change the practice of science itself. Do we want to remain part of the problem, or do we want to become part of the solution? And the scientists have to take that initiative. They are being paid to take that initiative because they're being paid to be the smart Alex in the society. So we are being perceived as arrogant, insular, deaf, illegitimate, all those things. And believe me, I have worked for 10 years in the field in all of the countries in Southern Europe when I tell you that that is very real and that that is one of the biggest barriers. So what can complex adaptive systems do here? I think it can help us to bridge between the past, the present, and the future. It can increase the dimensions rather than reduce them. It can also, but that is a little bit more difficult, create engagement between the scientists and the practitioners. And one of the issues that is a really important one here is the role of technology. Technology is seen by some as being ruled by material laws. By others see it as being ruled by social laws. But what people, I think, very often don't take into account, that it has its completely own logic. And that is where I think Brian Arthur has done in his recent work some fantastic ideas. Because in part, he argues that contrary to what the economists always thought, that the technology was embedded in the economy, he actually argues that it is the economy that is embedded in the technology, because the periodicities of the rhythms of economics are actually faster than the technological ones. Now, of course, we're hitting a point where that may no longer be the case towards the future as we accelerate. So one of the things we also need to do, because that was my starting point, we need to remove the limits to information processing. And that is where ICT can contribute a lot. It can help improve the society's information processing, provided we go much further in the integration between human and mechanical automated information processing. And of course, we have this whole big data thing coming up. Now that might help with the problem of the misfit between theories and data. And so ultimately, we may be able to get sufficient data to actually have a much better sense of which of our theories are more effective. But we also need to combine an ex post and an ex-ante logic in the ways we're doing. And it's all right, and I will finish in that time. I have 2 more slides, I think. One of the fundamental things here is that we use our computing generally, not totally, but overwhelmingly in a reductionist mode. And what we need to be doing is do the reverse. We need to get our computing capability to start increasing the number of dimensions. And somebody who is working on this in a very interesting way is Walter Fontana in Harvard, for example, who generates out of a very limited set of data several thousand theories and then starts looking at which theories are actually the more probable and are not. Then finally, and this gets to the communication part, and this is something that's been touched upon both yesterday and by Peter Hout this morning, is the whole idea that we have to basically, by sort of data mining, get a sense of what the things are that in the society might actually be relevant to where things are going, and then help stimulate those. And I call this emergence by design. It emerges from the bottom, but we actually work on it by design. And this is a title of a European project that I'm involved in. And then finally, we have to deal with these unanticipated consequences. We have to begin to compare the choices we've made with the options that we haven't chosen from the perspective of the unintended consequences. Otherwise, we'll never get there. This is a more simple thing. I think part of the problem is this goes between disciplines, but it also goes between science as a whole and politicians or governance people or the general public. We create these auras without telling how badly we are actually organized, without telling how infinitely small our knowledge actually is. And by creating that aura, it's like the white lab coats. It's like the doctors, and I apologize if there are any in the room, but there is a sense in which there is a mystique that is being kept around science that we would do much better to actually get rid of. And this is sort of a more postmodern language to explain all of that, which I'll just skip. And then finally, we have to change the institutional context. We have to break through this identification between scientists and government institutions. We have to regain a sense of independence, but that should not become the kind of positivist we don't want and we don't have a judgment. It basically means that we have to rethink how to be citizen scientists. And I do believe, well, this is the last one, but I'll leave that without it. You understand from the title what I mean there. Okay.
Stay here, please. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay. Questions? Please. Can someone give her the mic?
Sheila Ranas from Walsh College. I think that academia prepares scholars in very narrow ways. As somebody who's been trying to do some interdisciplinary work, at least at my institution, on and off for many years, and in different institutions, the problems of tenure track, you can only publish in these journals or you don't even get considered, and things like that really hamper the scientific community. Do you have any insight into how academia could evolve to be tolerant of interdisciplinary programs, especially at the doctoral level, sure, where emerging science will be between disciplines?
Okay, question is clear, I think.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I work at an institution, Arizona State, that is trying to do this for the last 15 years and to fundamentally change the career structure within the university. It's incredibly difficult. I did it first as a director of a department, then as a dean, and a lot of it only worked because effectively I had the kind of prestige that would it push through the higher administration. And it was extremely difficult every single time. So this is an absolute requirement in how we change institutions. I didn't, because it was the end of my talk, get into those kinds of aspects, but it's fundamental.
Okay. Is there hope then?
I think there's hope, but there's a hell of a lot of work.
Okay. No, I was in Finland in Helsinki, and I saw a new technical university, which was completely interdisciplinary.
Yeah. Well, let me, if you give
there is
me
hope,
time by asking me or putting another remark in there. One of the things we've done is we have very systematically gone over to problem-based learning, in which we actually tell the students, here is a real-life problem. Go and try and deal with it. We're there as sources of information, but we're not going to tell you how to do it. And we bring people together from very different backgrounds and have them work like that. And one of the things that we've done recently is because the city of Phoenix had no money and statutorily had to have a 10-year plan, we designed its 10-year plan that way. And we're doing other things like that.
Okay.
This actually was borrowed from two universities in Europe, the University of Maastricht, who's been doing this for quite a while, and the University of Aalborg in Denmark, who has also been doing this.
Okay, next one. Yes. You said you had no questions anymore this morning. And now you say a small one, eh?
Okay, go ahead.
We, when you are saying we.
Where,
We?
in my formal talk, it basically meant either us as scientists or us as human beings.
So you are not assigning yourself to the science group and trying to see what you
No,
get.
I'm keeping an anthropological perspective on the different communities. That is what I argued before the slides came on. And that is fundamental. And that's also what gets me into trouble with many scientists.
Yeah, I would say so.
Oh yes, believe me.
Okay, next one. Please.
So I'm thinking of James Scott's work, Seeing Like a State,
Yeah.
in which the path to disasters like the Green Revolution is when you get a simplistic understanding of nature presented to an authoritarian government that pushes through a solution which has unintended consequences.
Yes.
So we're talking about presenting ideas to policymakers here, and these people want answers.
Yeah.
How do you avoid repeating these mistakes? How do you avoid giving them complexity as the answer, which then has its own
Basically, what
consequences?
I said earlier on is that I would start basically engaging the politicians involved in a discussion and not try and put any scientific idea over to them, but basically try and think with them about their problem from the perspective that I have. And that's not an elevator speech. This takes hours and is a really intensive and difficult thing to do, but it's fundamental to my mind.
You've got to become a kind of an expert. Yeah. Is that an answer to your question? Yes, I suppose.
The answer is that it takes a lot of time, you can't be simplistic about it.
Yeah, yeah. But on the other hand, we need to make that investment.
Yeah, but
I want to follow up on that
Yeah.
exact point,
Yeah,
though, Sander. At the same time, policymakers do have to make decisions.
I know.
And so I want to push you a little bit harder on
Sure.
this to say, how do you balance those two constraints? On the one hand, you need a long-term, evolving conversation. On the other hand, the knowledge that scientists and engineers carry with them, that people both in the traditional sciences and in the complexity sciences carry with them, are critical for the decisions that are made. And often the fallback mode is to say, well, if I can't explain it all, if I can't have all that time, well, then I'm just not going to get involved because I don't want to give them incomplete information. So the policy gets made and decided without any information.
I know.
And so there has to be some level of socialization of the discomfort to scientists as well.
Absolutely.
To say, get over yourself. You don't have to have all the answers. You need to be involved when the pressure and the stakes are high.
That is why I talked about opening the kitchens of the science itself. You're absolutely right that that is absolutely fundamental. To give you one little anecdote, I was at one point with one of the secretaries of state of one of the European countries in the EU's agriculture department. And it's the only time that I was physically thrown out of an office that I had made an appointment for, because they did not want to know what any scientists had to say.
Are politicians and policymakers really interested in scientific contributions? Do they have the time for giving attention to that?
I think it is very variable, and you can only deal with this on an ad hoc situation. But I also have a more general answer. I would argue that one of the things we need to do in our very early education is begin to get kids thinking in terms of alternatives rather than sort of truths or whatever have you. Of course that's difficult, because a teacher has to, on the one hand, socialize the kids, and on the other hand, develop their thinking. And it's easier to socialize them by having them all think about the same thing. But that is not ultimately the kind of solution that we need for this.
Okay. Other questions? Remarks? Please.
I just think that there is a necessity for scientists to be more humble in terms of
Yes.
approach. The people, for example, the Green Revolution, if we took, we're not being honest that we don't completely understand the concept. I think there's a tendency for science to come to a conclusion too quickly, and of course you need policymakers needs to make policies. But when we as scientists, when we disclose our information, we need to be very honest that there are certain aspects of the problem that we don't know. That's one thing that, and there's also, of course, a necessity to be humble from the politician side, to admit probably to the public about that aspect.
Of course, I completely agree. That is again why I think we have to open the kitchens of what we're doing, and why I actually, in one of the slides, mentioned the fact that we're perceived as arrogant, dumb, and illegitimate.
Thank you.
Is that what society thinks about science?
Certain people, but yes, this is an ethnographic experience that I've had in many Southern European countries, because that was the work I was doing in the 1990s.
Okay.
Angela?
Please.
I'm sure we'll continue this conversation, but we've come under the umbrella of foresight into a conversation around complexity and governance. And I want to pick up I want to pick up the point of learning for the future.
Yeah.
And from what I see around a lot of the foresight practices is they're increasingly moving into this space of trying to think about moving upstream and looking at framing and trying to grapple with the idea of diversity of perspectives. But we keep hitting a challenge, is that we can deconstruct and open up the space, but then we don't know how to reconstruct and move it on for decision making. And do you have some reflections on that?
I don't necessarily.
That's a good question.
It's an extremely good question, but this lady always has good questions, and I know that from other moments. So, I would argue that the difficulty here was summarized by one of the speakers, either yesterday or maybe it was Peter Ho this morning, and basically say the only way to do this is to live it, and to actually experiment, and to what did he say? It wasn't fail safe, but safe fail. I think that is the really important part here, that it is actually possible to make the mistakes, but that we find ways to feed them back into actually learning actively and proactively in a constructive way. But that's not a detailed answer, and I don't think there is a detailed answer. I very fundamentally believe, and this is an argument I've had for a long time with the president of my university, who wants to fundamentally construct a complex system. And I don't think you can do that without living that complex system.
Okay. Yes, please. We have some more time, because I got a letter. Foresight will end late. Lunch will be at about 1 p.m. So we can extend questions and answers and discussion.
Okay. All right, Peter.
Yes. I guess this is a question about if you are identify as a scientist, you will enter the room of a policymakers or management group as a scientist, and you will try to use the words. If you're going to live and breathe the language of a management group or policymakers, you have to talk differently to be relevant. Then you come back to conferences like this, and you try to use the words of policymakers and management groups. You're going to be not taken seriously because you're talking the lingo of a practitioner. Could you just talk to me about that? It's not a very precise question.
I can try and talk about that. I have seen myself for a long time basically as a translator. between not only natural languages, but also different scientific languages and different disciplinary languages. And that is the basis of creating the kind of transdisciplinarity that we want to go for. But what most of us don't do is actually extend that concept beyond what are the traditional scientific disciplines. It is this, I had a colleague, a British colleague at one point, who was given this amazing brief by British Rail. Find out why we, British Rail, love British Rail and what it does, and why the public hates it. And basically, the engineers were so proud of what they were doing that they didn't understand, that it didn't relate to the needs of the society. Those are the kinds of translations you also need to do.
Please.
I like the way you put government and science into a kind of potential dialogue with each other, but it seems to me there's a third party to that, and that has to do with economic interests, corporations. I think a lot of the skepticism towards science from the public is actually because they perceive science to be part of a machine of wealth concentration and a lack of interest in them and their fate. It's not really a scientific discussion, unfortunately.
No. I think you're absolutely right. I mentioned at some point towards the end that the way in which science is institutionalized is actually a major handicap. I did not mention business because this topic here is particularly about governance and science, but you're absolutely right. I should also say that from a sustainability perspective, my experience over the last few years is that I find it a lot easier to talk to really top business people than I find it to talk to government people.
Okay.
Close enough.
Yeah. Is this what you were doing here? As what you were saying, that you've got to open the kitchen.
Yeah.
This is what always has been said of institutions like car producers who are getting in big problems. Then the communication advisor, the first thing they're saying, open the kitchen. Mm-hmm. So make yourself, they have a beautiful word for it, make yourself transparent. Well, and it never helps. So why
I don't think it is a question of transparency. I think making it transparent sort of implies that you keep your structure. I meant by opening up the kitchen is to actually talk about all the internal failures and the problems that are emerging, the bricolage that is actually going on in the various disciplines.
Can I ask you another question? Is this what you are saying here?
Yeah.
It's I would almost say it's a new kind of talking narratives on science.
Yeah.
Because this is not what you frequently hear in the scientific community. That people are talking about them. What they want to say every now and then is, yes, we need to recover our legitimation, but that won't cost too much time and it's easily done because we are very good. Yeah. That's the standard language. Yeah? That's the way of talking about it, and we are very helpful to the big problems which society and the world is dealing with. But you are saying you have a total different language. You're saying, so. That's true. Yeah, did you sleep not too well this night, or is it?
That's also true, and you know that. But that's not the reason, because I actually prepared all of this before I was sleepless. Okay.
Okay.
No, but this is a very, very. Look, if a few years ago the sort of Nobel Committee that advised the United Nations Secretary General about sustainability basically made as its main argument that we need a completely new mindset. Yeah. It is the famous saying of Einstein, you can't solve the problems if you keep thinking the same way. Yeah. And what I'm trying to argue is for that very different mindset, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, but I'm going to talk about that with you in detail.
All right. I'd be delighted.
I think it's 1 o'clock, and I think we are entitled to have lunch, isn't it? So thank you very much.